Welcome to the first in a series of the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE. I'm your host, Michelle Collins, and with me, I have Dr. Lisel Windsor. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Windsor is a board-certified Developmental-Behavioural Paediatrician.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you do specifically?
No problem. So, I'm a pediatrician. I essentially do all things development. So, anytime there's a question or an issue related to a child's learning or their motor skills, so walking, running, etc., or their language skills, I'm the person that you refer to. I'm the person who generally helps figure out what the issue is stemming from.
And of course, our topic for today is Early Childhood Developmental Milestones. So, can you give us or give our listeners a little bit of insight in terms of what does that mean?
So, developmental milestones are essentially markers. So, they give us an idea of what skills a child should have by a certain age, based on the average ages of the population when they attain those skills. And so the reason why we care about milestones is that the earlier we notice that there's a problem, the sooner we can intervene. And we know that age between 0 to 5 years is particularly important for intervention. Children's brains are growing at a fantastic rate. And so if we can provide additional support at those times, 0 to 5 years, then we know that the long-term outcomes are much, much better.
So you touched on a few things. In terms of the markers, what are some of the most significant markers or milestones parents and caregivers can expect to see in the first years of a child's life?
So when we think about development, we're thinking about 4 core areas of development. So we're thinking about motor skill development, we're thinking about communication or language development, we're thinking about cognitive skills, and then we're also thinking about social emotional skills. And so for each of those domains, you have milestones that we're expecting this child to meet by a certain time. Milestones and development, they stack on each other. So we expect them to be sequential, right? Meaning that you don't start running before you roll over, right? And so, for example, with your motor milestones, what we're thinking about in that first year is that a child is going to lift their head, start rolling over by 2 to 4 months of age, start sitting up by 6 months of age, start pulling themselves up to take their first steps around 9 to 12 months of age. And then after that comes your running, jumping, climbing, etc. Anytime we have delays in those milestones, we start asking what's going on. Similarly, with your language milestones, within that first year of life, you're expecting a child to start making gurgling sounds in those first few months. By about 4 months of age, you start hearing some cooing, which is those vowel sounds, and then babbling, so the ba, ba, da, da, etc., right? And then those are the foundations for words, right? And a lot of the initial words are like mama, dada, titi, things that are important to this child, but also easy to say because they already have the babbling down. And so by 1 year of age, we're expecting at least one word in addition to mama and or dada. And so development goes. By 2 years of age, we're expecting that you're starting to put 2 words together. By 3 years of age, 3 words together, and so on and so forth. We're also expecting you to be able to start telling stories as you get older, right? So it's not just about asking for what you want, but also telling about what has happened in your day or in your life as a 4 or 5 year old. With our cognitive skills, what we're thinking about is problem solving. So if I give you a new problem, how do you figure out how to get that toy on top of the chest of drawers that mommy put there out of my reach, right? So children are always figuring out problems, always trying to get to what they need or want. And what we would expect is that a child would, over time, learn how to get what they need and what they want, right? And so again, that also progresses in a stepwise fashion. And finally, social emotional skills. And so social emotional skills, I think, are the ones that are least paid attention to in many cases. But things as simple as making eye contact, responding if your caregiver smiles at you, making sounds to get people's attention, showing things that are interesting to you and sharing those with people that you love and care about, wanting to be involved with other people with play and that kind of thing. Those are some of the milestones that we would expect within the first few years of life.
You said that the social emotional skills are the least focused on. Can you explain why and what's the significance of paying more attention to those social emotional skills?
Yeah, so I think one of the most common concerns I have from parents coming to me has to do with talking. So most parents are like, he's one. Why isn't he able to say his whole alphabet? Why can't he say all these words? Or I can't understand anything he says. And so I feel that in many cases, speech and language, people have a fair idea, and maybe they overestimate what a child should be able to do at various times in their lives. Similarly, with motor skills, if you have a 2-year-old not running around, then that's fairly obvious. It's fairly obvious to the eye, right? So other 2-year-olds are running around. My 2-year-old isn't walking yet. Like, this may be something I need to be concerned about. So social emotional skills are what we call softer skills, right? So they're more subtle. And I think that for many parents, if a child is doing all the other things, then they don't worry so much about those things, or they may not necessarily pick up that there's a delay in that area until maybe a child goes to school and then the teacher is saying, oh, this child is not necessarily playing with the other children in the way we would expect. And so I suspect that parents just may miss those signs more frequently because they're more subtle.
Thank you so much. So let's go back to the cognitive skills. Mm-hmm. How do cognitive skills develop in the early childhood, and what activities or experiences can help stimulate a child's intellectual growth?
So, as I would have mentioned, cognitive skills refer to a child's problem-solving skills. And so a lot of what a child is able to learn has to do with their environment. Stimulation, right? If a child notices that when I do A, B happens consistently, then they learn this is how I get what I need, or this is how I get what I want. And so in building cognitive skills, the most important thing really is for an attentive parent. And so if a child makes a sound trying to get your attention or trying to get some milk or whatever they want, and a parent responds every time, this child learns that when I do this, I get a response. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful that parents will hear over and over again during the course of this conversation is that being present, being responsive, listening to your child and picking up on their cues actually helps them learn more, build those cognitive skills more than, let's say, watching a video or an educational, quote-unquote, educational show. Being present, being responsive goes a very, very long way when we're talking about a child's cognitive development.
And you just spoke about, being present and understanding and responding to your child. Let's talk about screen time and technology. In today's digital age, how does screen time and exposure to technology impact early childhood development?
I feel like this is such a touchy question. If you ask pediatricians, right, what we learn is less than 2 years of age, no screen time.
Really?
Correct.
Wow.
Zero.
But we stick them in front of the tablets, in front of the TV, in front of the phone.
And so what I would say is that in an ideal world, as close to zero as possible. But we also understand that we have single parents. We have parents or grandparents who may be caring for a child on their own. and need to find something safe for them to do while they take care of household business and that kind of thing. But keeping in mind that a child is going to learn best from the people around them as opposed to the screen is something that I always try to tell parents. I think that there's this idea, especially as media has evolved, that this television can teach my child colors, letters, numbers, shapes. It must be good for them. But really and truly what we've learned is that a child learns much more if a parent sits with them and is talking about the colors of the blocks, counting the blocks with them, singing songs and that kind of thing. And so, yes, the literature says 0 to 2 years of age, no screen time or minimal screen time, right? But screens are certainly a tool that I don't want a parent to feel like guilty about having to use from time to time. But keeping in mind that as little as possible and as much face time, parent to child or caregiver to child as possible, really ensures that your child's development is maximized and optimized.
Wow. Dr. Windsor, that was very informative. We'll take a short break and be right back. Just before the break, we were speaking about screen time and technology. So, Dr. Windsor, can you just share a little bit more in terms of any negative impact of prolonged screen time for our young children?
So I do want to say that, especially in the era of COVID, screen time has evolved, and I see screens sometimes as becoming a member of the family for some families who don't have the option of additional childcare. So parents who would be working from home but also need to care for their child at home. I think during COVID in particular created this culture where children are being placed in front of screens, whether it's a telephone screen, a TV screen, a tablet, they all count, just for the purposes of keeping them busy and occupied. And so now that things are kind of returning to some degree of normalcy, there have been some challenges for families to transition back to that face-to-face time. And so in terms of potentially negative effects, certain things that I have noticed with my patient population in particular would have been the impact of screen time on social emotional skills in particular. So we would have talked a little bit before about how cognitive skills are built by parents being present and responsive. And similarly, social emotional skills are built in very much the same way. And really all the developmental milestones can be supported by parents being present and responsive to their children. And so with the increased levels of screen time or increased amount of screen time, what I've seen is less of that time to engage with family members, less of that making eye contact, making requests, showing things and sharing things that are interesting for that child with the parent. And it kind of goes both ways because, yes, you have this child who's totally zoned in to the screen for extended periods of time, but then you also have adults who are on their screens and who are not as responsive to their children because of the fact that they're scrolling or watching videos, etc. And so social emotional skills certainly have been impacted by screen time. The other thing that we see is that children become more sedentary or less active as a result of being in front of the screen so frequently. And so I have noticed that the more screens or the more access to screens that children have, the more they want, right? So it becomes, we all know how it is even as adults. You can look up and like 2 hours have passed and you've been on Instagram this whole time, and where's the time gone? And similarly for children, often there is this release of chemicals in the brain when person interacts with screens, that causes a craving for more of the same. And so it becomes more desirable than, let's say, going outside and skipping or kicking a ball or doing all those other things. And so I have seen as well where a more sedentary lifestyle can occur, and then all the downstream effects of that with obesity and health impacts for children who spend a lot of time in front of screens. And this was even before COVID. And so thinking about those things certainly gives us motivation to find other ways to get these children away from these screens, not just because screens are bad, quote unquote, but because of the impact it has on children otherwise.
There's that instant gratification being in front of the screen that you won't really get in real life,
yeah,
would you?
It's true. It's true.
So just going back, because we want to refocus in terms of milestones, what can parents do to keep their children, their young children, engaged, and not spend all of this time on a screen, be it tablet, phone, in front of the television? Sure.
So I'm going to say this again and again, being present and being responsive. And so we're often talking about parents getting down at their children's level, right? So not just telling them to go and play, but playing with them, right? So if your child is at the stage of building blocks, we're building blocks together, right? We drive in cars together. Lots of facial expressions, lots of body language, lots of engagement to keep this child entertained, right? One of the other things that screens make harder is entertainment, right? Because a child goes to school and there are no flashing lights, there's no colors, not in the way that a screen can provide. But what we can provide is a lot of expression and a lot of energy as a parent, right, or as a caregiver. And so getting down on a child's level, meeting them where they are and engaging in what they're interested in as opposed to what we want them to do would be one thing that I would suggest. The other thing I would suggest is parents thinking about how they can get their child involved in what they're doing. And so I have to clean the house or I have to cook. How can I give, Ayana a little job to do on the side where they feel like they're contributing? They might be in their high chair and they're cutting up their little vegetables with, a plastic knife or whatever. And while you're doing that, you're singing, you're talking, you're telling stories. And so the child is engaged outside of having to put them in front of the screen. But you as a parent are also able to get what you need done. I have much older siblings, and so I would also say lean on family members, right? So if there's a 10-year-old and a 2-year-old or a 15-year-old and a 5-year-old, then thinking about, well, they can go outside and kick the ball together, or, he could give his brother a piggyback, they could play hide and seek. Like, these are things that, older siblings can help with while mommy or daddy might be cleaning, doing an assignment or other things like that. So those are just a few things that I can think of that might help divert attention from screens to more face-to-face time.
And there's so much learning that can take place. We spoke about the language, motor and physical skills, cognitive, even when children are helping their parents doing those daily chores or cooking, etc. Mm-hmm. Thank you so very much. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of children and their milestones, we know that children develop at their own pace. What should parents know about individual variations in reaching those developmental milestones?
It's a really good question. So one of the core facets of developmental milestones is the idea of comparisons, right? Mm-hmm. So some very smart researcher would have looked at a number of children in the population and realized that most of the times, let's say by 9 months of age, a child is pulling up and standing, right? But there's actually a range of what we would call typical development. So not every child at exactly 9 months of age is going to do exactly what we as doctors are looking for, right? So there is often a little bit of leeway on either end for a child to do something earlier or later. than that specific milestone. However, what we would expect is that, for example, by 18 months of age, that most children will be walking, right? There might be a few stragglers who squeeze in at 17 months and a few early walkers who might be chasing their siblings at 9 months of age, but those are the extremes. Most children by 1.5 are learning to walk. And so by the time we get to 18 months, we really are going to start getting concerned if a child isn't meeting that particular milestone. I think that there are pros and cons to seeing milestones or development as an individual process. The pros are that a parent shouldn't worry if a child is within the average range, right? It may be later than their siblings, but it may still be within the expected time. But similarly, the challenge that we sometimes have is that parents think, oh, well, my first child said their first words at 5, and that's okay because they're individuals and like these milestones are not necessarily for my child, right? And so what I generally recommend is that parents talk to their pediatrician. If there are any questions about the milestones, if there are any questions about, doc, I read online, X, Y, and Z, and my child isn't doing it yet. Should I be worried? I mean, even though their brother did it much later and they were fine, or grandma is saying that my uncle did it much later, is it okay for them to do it this late? Because while there is some leeway, while developmental milestones come in ranges, normal or typical is a range, we also don't want to miss things, right? And it's better to check and see than to wait and see. Always better to check, right? So that's what I would suggest to parents.
Thank you so very much. So if there are any concerns, if they're not meeting the milestones, we know that they need to go see a professional,
Correct.
see a pediatrician.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much,
Sure.
Dr. Windsor. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE with Dr. Windsor. Dr. Windsor, just before the break, we were talking about developmental milestones, but let's focus on the 3 to 5. Are there any developmental milestones that children should be reaching? And if not, what should parents do?
So in the 3 to 5 age group, we're thinking preschoolers. So that is the ECCE age group, right? So coming out of 1 to 2 years of age, as I would have mentioned, development, it progresses in a sequence. And so we're looking for that 1 to 2 years old developing appropriately so that these children at 3 to 5 years old are able to do all the things that we expect of them. Now, thinking about those developmental domains again, motor, language, cognitive, and social emotional skills, we're also looking at what should a child be doing at that 3 to 5 year old age group. With their motor skills, we're expecting them to be proficient runners. They are supposed to be excellent at their job, which is play, right? So lots of running, climbing, hopping on one leg, but also jumping with both feet. Those are things that we would generally expect that a 3 to 5 year old would have mastered. With their fine motor skills, meaning the small muscles in their hands, these children should be feeding themselves. They should be able to hold a writing tool, so a crayon, a pencil, or pen. Between the 3 to 5 year age group, they're learning how to hold a pencil like an adult would, right? So they would start with holding it with their whole palm, and then the fingers will come into play. And so being able to trace and form letters, those are things that closer to the 5 year age group, these children are mastering. With regards to their language skills, as I would have mentioned before, language at a 3 to 5 year old level is no longer about single words, right? We're talking about putting words together to make sentences. not just for fun, but to be able to tell stories. So a 5-year-old should be able to come home and tell mommy what happened today at school. They should be able to talk about the trip to the zoo. They should be able to talk about their favorite book or their favorite movie in simple terms, right? But beyond just putting words together, we want them to be able to tell stories and to be able to have a back and forth conversation by 5 years of age. With regards to cognitive skills, we're thinking about problem solving and learning, right? So the problem solving skills of 1 to 2-year-olds, how do I get to that toy on top of the chest of drawers, now becomes, how do I solve this math problem? How do I count? Is this child learning their letters, right? And so we're not expecting a child at 3 to know all the letters, numbers, shapes, colors, but certainly after they've had some exposure to that in a school or preschool setting, by 4 to 5 years of age, these should be things that are automatic for them, right? So colors, letters, numbers, and shapes, and just beginning to understand letter sounds would be things that we would be looking out for, with hopes that these are the building blocks for reading and math in future years. So if there's an issue at that point, then we start thinking about how is this going to impact their learning going forward. And then the last domain, social emotionally, we expect that children would want to be engaged. So engagement at a 1 to 2-year-old level looks slightly different at 3 to 5 years old, right? So we would expect them to be initiating play. We would expect them to be almost pests to their parents in terms of always wanting somebody to play with them and nobody wants to play with them. We should hear about it if they're having to play on their own or entertain themselves. With their siblings and with their classmates, we're expecting them to learn to share, right? Whether it's their books or whether it's a library situation where everybody has access and they're able to use something in turn, taking turns, right? Playing games together with minimal drama, right? Those are things that we would expect socially, emotionally. Again, wanting to tell people about their day, wanting to share with them. Sometimes I think parents get overwhelmed in the car on the way home when the child will not stop talking, but that's what we want because they have a relationship with their parent and they want to tell them about all of the things, right? Now, the second part of your question was, what should we do if the child is not making these milestones? And we should always be thinking about seeing their doctor. If there are any concerns health-wise, and development is a part of this child's overall health, then we want to think about seeing your doctor at your health center, seeing your private practitioner if you have a pediatrician, just seeing someone who has experience and knowledge in this area of children that can give you feedback on next steps, right? So is there an underlying medical issue? Is this something that a psychologist should be looking into? What kind of assessment or further investigation needs to be done so that we know what's going on and what should be done next?
Thank you so very much, Dr. Windsor. We talk a lot about parents being present, parents being involved in their child's day-to-day life, playing, etc. What are some red flags and early interventions in terms of that may indicate a development, a delay or concern, and what steps should parents take? First, what are the red flags and what should parents do?
Yeah, so I think that parents, number one, should be observant, right? I think that parents often ignore intuition when they feel in their gut that something's not quite as I would expect, or this child is developing differently to the other children that I have. Sometimes a parent might take a child to a playground and see that their child plays differently to the other children who are their age. Or a parent might get feedback from a school that their child isn't quite meeting the milestones that they would expect for their age. Those would be all good avenues for a parent to start kind of digging deeper, but also being aware of the milestones, right? Making sure that you're keeping your appointments with the doctor, because part of the regular checkups for children have to do with, is this child, not just is their height and weight okay, but is this child actually walking when they should be, running when they should be, having conversation when they should be, learning as they should be. And so I can't stress the importance of maintaining that preventative health, seeing your doctor, making sure that they are checking the milestones, but also if you have concerns, bringing them up, not allowing them to simmer, so that you're checking with your doctor to see if there are any red flags, but also being proactive as a parent, right, to make sure to mention if things have come up that you're worried about.
So what can you recommend in terms of resources for parents? Books, websites, a go-to so that they can get this information?
Yeah, so, we talked about screens being a tool, and I think that this is one of those things. Google is one of the best and worst things, and so just being very mindful about the fact that at our fingertips, we can find almost anything under the sun. And so certainly there are websites like the American Academy of Pediatrics that talk about developmental milestones, what to look out for, what would red flags look like, right, at each developmental stage. The CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control, also has milestone trackers. So parents from birth onward can actually track their child's development to see if there's either minimal or no progress in certain areas that need to be addressed. Thinking about certain websites. So I often talk to parents about websites like ABC Mouse, right, or Reading Rockets. So if they were to Google those things, they would find resources on how to work with their child on building some of those foundational skills in that preschool 3 to 5-year-old range. I cannot stress the importance of parents being present enough, right? Because even without all the resources, without any fancy toys, without any parenting books, parents who are able to sit with their child, read together with their child. We don't even care so much what you're reading, right? It can be a picture book, no words involved, right? But lots of describing, using words and actions to communicate with your child. With things that you have around your house, those are things that are going to be extremely, extremely helpful. And so just encouraging parents to use the tools that they have for reading, singing, pretend play. I mean, you don't have to have a fancy, bubble machine. Can you make bubbles with squeezy and then talk about the bubbles going up and down and pop and all of the jumping and all of that kind of stuff? Those would be things that I would emphasize more than anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Windsor. This was a very insightful conversation. We spoke about parents being present, being engaged with their children, playing with them, identifying and observing them. And if there is a concern, go to their clinic, go to their doctor, go to the pediatrician. So thank you very much for this information. It was indeed very informative. Thank you for joining us on the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE.